So Dr. Ellen Maccarone has been teaching applied ethics in Gonzaga's philosophy department since 2005, correct? So approximately 10 years longer than I've been here. I know, however, that another one of Dr. Maccarone's area of research, as well as a personal passion, is Jesuitism. That is to say, a reflection on and enactment of its mission within the Jesuit University. In fact, Dr. Maccarone is the acting vice president for mission integration here at Gonzaga. And so who better to talk to us about Jesuit formation for lay people and what the university is currently doing to be more deliberate about Jesuit formation than her. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Ellen Maccarone.
Thanks, Tyler. So what I've got today is a little bit of a PowerPoint to keep me on track more than anything else. I've sprinkled in a couple of photographs for your benefit. And then I hope that, we can have some conversation as we go along. But to that end, I'm going to share my screen if I can find the right part. That's really not what I wanted. Okay, let me try this again. I thought I opened it. That is not. This is, I thought I was better at technology as I, oh, there we go. Okay, great. And slideshow. So here we are. To begin at the beginning, this is my parents. This is the day during the pandemic when they both came down in Gonzaga gear. They didn't plan it, it just happened. So Dad took a picture. So I was raised Catholic and I'm a practicing Catholic, but I didn't go to Catholic schools. I lived in a region outside of Boston where there were not good Catholic school options for girls in particular. My parents were both public school teachers, and so they couldn't see not sending me to public schools. And then for university, I just didn't choose Catholic schools. I didn't have any real exposure to Catholic school, so I chose what I thought was best. I went to George Washington University for undergrad, Colorado State University, and the University of Florida for graduate school. But by the time I had my first teaching job, I knew that I needed something different for myself. But I was concerned with, at that point, my secular education and whether or not that was going to be an impediment for me getting to a Catholic school to teach in. But I'm really happy to be here at Gonzaga teaching and doing other work. So how did I get here? The way that I thought about education and thought about teaching was very easy to translate into the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm before I even knew that was a thing. And when I interviewed for my job here at Gonzaga, in my first round interview, which is over the telephone, I was hopped up on cold medicine. I could hardly think straight, but was just trying to be my genuine self. And it came up in the interview. Eric, were you on that search committee?
I was not.
You were not. It came up in the interview that I had included a page about my understanding about the Catholic intellectual tradition in my application. Later, I found out that that was very important for me even getting the phone interview. But the reason I included that was another Catholic school had asked for a statement, your personal understanding of the Catholic intellectual tradition. So I included that in every Catholic school application that I applied to. I figured I wrote it, I might as well send it along. And when I got here for my campus visit interview, I was still pretty nervous about whether or not I was going to be accepted, because people were asking me, like, why didn't you go to Catholic schools? What do you think you're going to add here? And it was a concern, but I just had to, pray a little harder and go on with my interview. And I thought the interview went pretty well, with like one exception, and I didn't know whether or not that was gonna tank it. Obviously, it didn't. But it really became clear to me that even during that interview, even before I got the job offer, that if I was going to move to Spokane from across the country, I wasn't just going to have to deal with the culture shock of being an East Coaster, now sort of on the West Coast, but there was a lot about Catholic higher education that I was going to have to learn. And when I was sitting telling my colleagues at the institution I was then teaching at that I wasn't coming back after getting the job offer, I sat at the student's chair of one of my colleagues, Rabbi Joseph Edelheit, and I told him about coming to Gonzaga, and he said to me, wow, he's like, that's really exciting. He's like, as a young Catholic woman getting to teach ethics at a Jesuit university, that's a big responsibility. And I think about that conversation a lot. And I remember saying to Joseph, doesn't sound like quite as much fun when you put it that way. But Joseph has been a good friend to me over these years, and occasionally does ask me how things are going. He's retired now and spends half a year in Minnesota and half of the year in Brazil. I know it's a rough life for him, but no, it's an interesting thing to think about, the fact that positionally, as a practicing Catholic and as a philosopher, teaching ethics at a Jesuit university does have a different level of responsibility than if I were differently positioned as an individual, had a different identity. And so that's the beginning of the story, right? So in some sense, I like to think about this in terms of vocational language, that there was a calling, right? That Gonzaga called me to do this work, and figuring out how to do that work well really entrenched me into asking questions and taking opportunities, the few opportunities there were. So I like to think about that as in terms of a calling to make the spiritual exercises. So there were no formal programs to form faculty or staff at Gonzaga in 2005. There was nothing, right? But it was still possible to have a personal relationship with a Jesuit or multiple Jesuits. Now that's much, much harder given how few Jesuits we have at the university. There are currently 7 Jesuits working at the university. That's it. The Della Strada community has about 26 Jesuits, but only 7 work at the university. So my first couple of years, Father Pat Lee, now rector of the Jesuit community at the University of San Francisco, was the vice president for mission. And I would leave my class on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday afternoon, walk past his office, and if he was in there by himself, I would be like, Pat, I have one more question. And often spent an hour or more sitting at his desk. And that really is where I think my informal Jesuit education really happened, was a lot sitting at that other chair. And then when I moved into the president's office half-time 7.5 years ago, I actually was in the office, I don't know what that was, in the office that Pat had. So it was a very warm and welcoming space because I had spent a lot of time in that office prior. And it was a great opportunity to ask any question free from a faculty, other faculty saying, you don't know that already? What are you doing here? Because Pat was just like, yeah, that's a good question. What does that mean to you? How do you how do you make that work in the classroom? Why is that a stumbling block for you? So in so many of those interactions I had with Pat, he was modeling Jesuit education for me, trying to figure out what my context was so that I could be moved forward a little bit. And after during my third year at Gonzaga, I made the spiritual exercises with the SEAL program, and that changed everything for me. I mean, really changed everything for me, because I had all these pieces from my conversations with Pat and from some other things that I was able to do and other relationships I had with other Jesuits. But making the spiritual exercises, both personally and professionally, put everything together in the package, in the right order, with the right purpose behind it. And I really didn't know that that was what was going to happen. You know, they say everyone comes to the exercises with a question. I didn't even know I was supposed to do that until halfway through. People are like, "What's your question?" I'm like, "Question? What are you talking about?" They're like, "Ellen, you got a lot of work to do." But I was really grateful that I had that chance to make the spiritual exercises through, you know, no small part, the university's subsidizing of that program. And I can talk more about SEAL and spiritual exercises later if any of you want to know. But it was a life-changing experience for me. And many people say that, and it's hard to really explain to people sometimes what you mean by that. But for me, personally, it changed the way I thought about my faith and my relationship with God and my relationship with Jesus. I grew up in a pretty old-fashioned Catholic household. We never talked about Jesus. We talked about Christ a lot, but we never talked about Jesus. He was never really a person, except in that triune sense of person. But the exercises made it real for me that he was a person, just like we're persons. Well, maybe not just like we're persons, but more like us than the old way of thinking about it. And professionally, it allows you access into St. Ignatius's his mind in a way, and his way of thinking about how you deal with persons. That was eye-opening and really informative about how I should be working with students, how I should be working with my colleagues, how I should be working with administrators, how I should be doing all of that interpersonal stuff. And that was a grace I didn't expect, because I thought I was on a spiritual journey. And it was on a spiritual journey, but of course it had professional implications as well. So, Ignatian Pedagogy. This is my favorite graphic about the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. There are lots of different ways that people talk about it, but I really like this one, because I do think that it's an iterative process, right? We need to know something about the context we're in so that we can create opportunities for experience in the right way. You know, we talk about meeting people where they are, and you can only do that if you understand the context, right? So experience, reflection, moving that reflection to action, then evaluation, then you're in a new context. So you have to start over again. And this way of thinking about teaching as developmental, even over the course of a single assignment or a unit in a semester, rather than a student's whole 4 years or 5 years or however long it takes them, I think is really important, because it reminds us that growth happens incrementally. And sometimes there's the opportunity that there's backsliding, right? Sometimes the evaluation is, this didn't go well, or, oh, they're back making that same mistake. We have got to think about the context in yet a new way. And I think this works not only for teaching, but other kinds of formation. We have to think about the context that we're in. Where are people coming from? And when we design formation programs now, we have to think about that. Like, who are the people we're trying to serve with these programs? What is it that's beneficial for them as individuals, as persons, as professionals that this can do? And, you know, also the benefit to the university, but that's a little bit secondary. I was lucky early on, I think because I was so persistent with Pat Lee and others, to get to go to some programs that were sort of formation, that were then run by the Oregon province, now by Jesuits West. So Western Conversations, I was able to go twice, and that was a little unusual for the Gonzaga use of that, but members of the different Western Jesuit schools get together for a weekend and deal with some particular issue and collaborate. Now that program is actually being revisioned right now by US West to be something that's much more intentionally a formation program. And I'm really excited about this and to be able to participate in some of that revisioning. And one of the things that it's going to do is really look at what newer faculty need, what they need for networking, what they need for opportunities to collaborate, what they need to understand what it's like to go through a Jesuit education process for themselves so that they can bring that back to their classrooms. And that's going to take kind of as a model, a program that's run by the AJCU, known as the Ignatian Colleagues Program. But that program's for leadership, right? And this is a picture of me and my group that went on an immersion to the Mexico border, January 2020, right before the whole world fell apart. Half of us are standing in Mexico and half of us are standing in the US in this picture. And there are people from various different Jesuit schools. And that program is an 18-month leadership development program. And it includes an immersion to work or to witness, better witness than work, with people in poverty of some kind. It includes a 7-day silent retreat, a version of the spiritual exercises, and a variety of different other meetings where we're working in collaboration on different kinds of leadership problems that people might have, and as they're growing in their leadership. Now, Ignatian Colleagues Program was designed about 16 years ago to make sure that lay leaders at Jesuit universities had some experience of formation, with that acknowledgement that at some point in the not distant future, our universities are going to be run not by Jesuits, but by lay people, and what it means for them to be leaders at Jesuit universities when there are so few Jesuits. Well, it means that they need some formation. So from the classroom to the boardroom. So for 10 years, I was a faculty member in the philosophy department. For the last 7.5 years, I was the faculty advisor to the president. So I was half-time in the president's office, and now acting vice president for mission integration. Now I'm responsible for formation programs for others. I've got a team that works on that. And part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this subject today was because I've learned an awful lot by having to cobble it together myself. And I don't want it to be that hard for other people, because I think it's so important for the kind of education we deliver and for people's personal growth. Whether they have a deep spiritual need or not, there's a lot to learn about Jesuit education from, say, the spiritual exercises or sessions about other things related to Jesuit education. And learning it on my own meant that I didn't always have great people to talk with about it, right? I had some friends who were younger Jesuits, so I had some conversation about it, and some older colleagues that had, some experience when we had the mission office, had, collaborators in mission as a group of faculty and staff. But for the most part, I was on my own, and I didn't always know what questions I should be asking. And we've designed mission formation programs for both faculty and staff that are cohort based and also one-off things. And we try really hard to collaborate with as many other offices and areas that we can to develop things that are suiting the different audiences that we need. For example, one of my folks who's a faculty staff mission specialist is giving a mini retreat for a department this week that's struggling with something. And they reached out and said, can you help us with this? We need someone to help guide some reflection so that we can come to some consensus about this important issue for our department. We've got folks in the staff assembly who are like, can we have a session, maybe co-hosted between mission and human resources about restoring relationships when there's been some fracture in an area. There's lots of things. There's lots of Jesuit resources to draw on. And we're trying really hard to fill those niches. But the focus on formation really are those cohort-based programs. They seem to be doing pretty well. We have a lot of takers. So over half of our new faculty signed up for the first year of the formation program this year. So we did go to Rome. This is a picture of us from Rome. And formation programs for faculty, staff, board of trustees, and new one for board of regents are coming online. This is the future of Jesuit education. We have to be more intentional about how we form the people who work here if we can call ourselves Jesuit when the day comes that there are no Jesuits. Of our 7, I think only 2 are not in their 60s. 1 is starting phased retirement this year, right? There will soon be 6. We are not on track to hire another Jesuit for the classroom. There are 5 Jesuits getting their PhD scheduled this spring. 5. That's it. 4 of them already have jobs, all in theologians, right? So what do we have to do to live into our Jesuit institutionness, if you will, is make sure that the faculty and staff are well formed. One of the members of our board, who is the president of Loyola High School in Los Angeles, who's a new member of our board, Father Greg Goethals, he made the comment that what we need is more people to make the exercises. That's what will be what keeps an institution Jesuit, is that the leadership has made the exercises. That's how you share some of the most fundamental formation that Jesuits have and have that worldview altered and changed. Some of the things that Father Sosa talked to us about is what role the institution, right, can play with the universal apostolic preferences. The first one, sharing the spiritual exercises, right? The others about walking with the marginalized, providing a hope-filled future, or walking with youth in a hope-filled future, and care for our common home. They're important, but they're all rooted in the spiritual exercises. That's the fundamental experience of the Jesuits that we interact with, and with the people that are the foundation of the heritage that we're a part of. That's the key. And so it came up interestingly in the Pope's address at the general audience. He was talking about prayer and discernment. And one of the things he said is that too many people come to prayer too formally. It's like, oh, like come to prayer. And he's like, oh, there's all this small talk and everything in prayer. And he's like, no, he goes, you should come to prayer like you're meeting an old friend. And the way he put it was really, it was entertaining, because of course he gives the address in Italian, and then someone gives you the highlights in a variety of different languages. But the part that we were like, what is he talking about? If your Italian wasn't good, he was like, blah, 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 no, ciao. And what he was saying was like, Don't do the small talk, none of that blah, blah, blah. Stop yourself. You should greet God in prayer, like ciao, which is, of course, the informal hello. Right. So I think that formation matters to us as an institution and to our students who aren't here, because it's the kind of education we promise is dependent on formation of enough people in the community. And it helps us live up to the claims of what kind of institution we say we are. And that's the real legacy of St. Aloysius Gonzaga and St. Ignatius of Loyola, is that we live that out in our interactions with our students, with each other, and with the wider community. That's where we really have to sort of remember that cura personalis, which is one of those Jesuit buzzwords, care for the whole person, also has a counterpart, and that's cura apostolica, care for the institution. Sometimes those things are in tension, but when you figure out how to work through that tension, that's the magis, right? That's the more, right? It's inviting us to be more creative, and forming more people helps us be more creative and true to our legacy at the same time. So that's a little bit about Jesuit formation, about my informal Jesuit education, and I'm happy to have some conversation, questions, what have you, if you've got them. Thank you.
Thank you. I know I heard that. You want me to go? Yeah. Okay. So I like that you're. So first of all, I was part of this pilot program for the Ignatian Colleagues Formation Program. I'm in the 3rd year now.
Thank you, Tyler.
The first, also the first, right?
Yep.
And so we're doing a sort of pilot group where they want us to kind of think of some big projects, campus, whatever. And so that's intriguing. But you're right, we have to train lay leaders because there's a dearth of Jesuits. And so I think I have 2 related questions.
Sure.
One is, in your opinion, why is there such a dearth of Jesuits? But number 2, is this something to commiserate, or is this rather maybe a grand opportunity that certain other institutions can have? Because what does that mean? Well, it means Jesuitism isn't what Jesuits do, but Jesuitism is the institution.
Yeah.
As you said later, like, there's the cura apostolica, right? And that might be a unique opportunity.
Yeah, so why do I think there's a dearth of Jesuits? Well, I mean, I think that the society we live in, the world we live in, fewer people see that as the way to meet their calling, right? Fewer people have a vocation to religious life in that way, because you can do a lot of things that in different points in time you could only do through, joining a religious order. You can do a lot of them now without it. Yeah, that's the context. Yeah, absolutely. I think, we're seeing, where there are Jesuits, it's the developing world, right? It's Africa, it's Asia, South America. They're just, it's just fewer here. I do think that we have an opportunity to, form people. I do think that is a really important opportunity. And I think some Jesuit institutions are going to go all in on that opportunity, but some won't. And that will be really telling, because I think it's very unlikely that there'll be 27 Jesuit colleges and universities in the United States in my lifetime. I don't know that we'll be able to support 27. Conversations are happening that are much more serious than they were even 5 years ago about whether or not this is going to continue, and not just because a couple of schools are struggling seriously financially, but about what it's going to take. And that's part of the reason why the AJCU has this process that we call the mission priority examen, All schools have done it once. All the Jesuit universities have done it once. Some schools have started their second time, and it's really an opportunity to sort of look at what you're doing. Does it make sense to call you a Jesuit institution any longer? Where are there things you still need to be doing? Gonzaga is set to do its second round 26-27, but preparations are already underway for that second phase of the MPE. I think the other thing to note, Tyler, about your question is we've started to see a shift in language to talking more about things as Ignatian than Jesuit, to be more open that you don't have to be a member of the Society of Jesus to do this, but you do need to sort of follow Ignatius and some of the things that he wanted for people who were making the spiritual exercises for the schools that he was, he and the Jesuits were supporting. But we're starting to see a lot more Ignatian language than Jesuit language to acknowledge that very thing, that, people are like, are you Jesuit? Like, no, I'm a Catholic woman. That's really not an option for me. I can be Ignatian though.
This is good.
I think it's an inclusive kind of shift, and I think it's important. That shift in language does rub some Jesuits the wrong way, and so we have to be prepared to talk about that. But that's a smaller issue, a smaller tension. Even they know that there are too few of them to do things the old way.
Particularly Jesuit problem?
No, I mean, other religious orders have already kind of dealt with this, many of them, because of course the Jesuits are still the largest worldwide religious order. But, the dwindling numbers for a lot of different religious orders have put this tension. The question is, how does Catholic higher education respond to this in such a way that we can keep higher education Catholic and not what's happened to so many of the once Protestant institutions that are now many only nominally Protestant, some not even anymore. They're like, yeah, we don't even talk about that anymore. Right. We have a seminary still, but like not really sure what's up with that, kind of attitude. So we're certainly not alone, but we are trying to learn from our Protestant counterparts how to be more intentional about this so it doesn't go that way.
So, Ellen, thank you so much for sharing this. I know I'm somebody from a Protestant background, and so I'm always, I'll say this casually, but I'm always a sucker for a great testimony. I mean, and this was a beautiful testimony.
Thank
not
you.
only about you personally, but also about Gonzaga and how those two testimonies intersect with each other.
Thank you.
And so I just really, I found that very inspiring. My question is, this is Socratic Club.
Mm-hmm.
I have always respected you for conversations we've had about mission, but also conversations we've had about philosophy. Most recent being about Jane Austen, bringing back to one of his essays. So my question to you is this: what's the relationship between the practice of philosophy and critical thinking and the practices that are bound up in Ignatian spirituality or the spiritual exercises? How do they relate to each other for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the sake of the recording, Eric's question is, how does the practice of philosophy relate to the formation experiences and mission that I have or have seen? That's a shorthand version of your question. So I guess it starts with the reason I ended up in philosophy in some sense. I mean, Eric Eric, I think you probably know if you don't remember, but I didn't major in philosophy as an undergrad. I majored in political science. And it's because I did come to that with the question very intentionally, as opposed to making the exercises. And my question was, how do people live peaceably together? I thought political science, isn't it hilarious in 2022 that in 1991, I thought political science was going to get me an answer to how we live well together. I mean, it's hilarious in retrospect. But quickly, even I figured out, didn't take it to be 2022 for me to figure that out, that I just wasn't going to get that answer from political science. Political science was about polling and data and everything. And the only part that was really interesting to me was the theory. And so I minored in ethics and then went down philosophy, right? How is it that we're supposed to live well with one another, right? And the spiritual exercises for me helps me answer that question, all right? The presupposition in the exercises, you know, which shorthand is, please understand people before you judge them. And when you judge them, be kind about it, right? When you correct someone, be kind about it, but don't correct anybody until you understand them, right? What is it to know yourself so well that you can have the freedom to do that, right? And the freedom to interact with others without worrying about being judged. That's a gift that I received from the spiritual exercises. Like when I'm cranky, I'm like, yeah, I don't care what you think. But in another day, like when I'm not cranky, I'm kind of like, well, you know, I don't really care what other people think, right? The tone makes a difference, but it's true. The spiritual exercises helped me learn myself well enough that I don't worry as much about that, because I learned to see myself as God sees me. The other thing about the practice of philosophy and, you know, Jesuit formation or Ignatian formation is that I find that there are different ways to honor the truth. And there are different ways to ask questions that help us get to the truth. And for those of us who are philosophers and we say we love wisdom, truth should still matter to us. And in my, you know, interview 18 years ago, John Wagner said, I like you. You still think there are some things that are true and some things that are false. And to this day, he calls me a truthist. And I was just like, as long as that is not, you know, like a truther, I'm good, right? Yeah, a truthist, right? Someone who still believes in the truth. And that's really important for me. I will say when I first started making the exercises, my spiritual director reminded me time and time again, this was not an academic exercise. This was not something to study. This was a spiritual experience that I was supposed to take. She forbade me to read anything she gave me with a pen or pencil in hand. She's like, no notes, no underlining. I was like, you're really killing me. But I did it, right? Because I really did want that full experience, but it was hard, right? And what my spiritual director told me is that you need to trust yourself and trust your relationship with God. And I was just like, you know, if you'd put it in any other terms, right? I don't know if Eric and Tyler remember this, but I wrote my master's thesis on trust. So I was like, all righty, right? But I took that, right? Like, well, what do I know about trust? How do I transfer that to this other kind of relationship, a relationship with God, when I was not inclined to do that, right? And it has changed the way I see things, and it's changed the way I ask philosophical questions in ways that I think are powerful and really help me relate to students and really help me show to students, like, look, this is worth caring about. During the pandemic, I taught a course in feminist ethics, and we did a 3-week unit on hope. They were like, you are a crazy woman. It's a pandemic. Why are you teaching us about hope? And I said, look, it's really easy to think you are not a hopeful person. Really easy right now. I'm like, but I swear to you, you are. And in the chat one day on Zoom, a little private message came in and it said, so Dr. Mack, I've been thinking about this question about hope. Are you kind of saying that if we don't have hope, all this stuff that we say we're activists about doesn't make any sense? Because if you didn't have hope, things would be different. Why would you bother? I was like, yeah, maybe. So I have no idea what's happened with the technology. So I'm just
with console rather than
with the actual Zoom. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm just gonna keep going. So those are some ways that I think that they have been mutually supportive and reinforcing, both personally and professionally. Welcome. Thanks for the question, Eric.
One thing that surprised me back today, I don't remember what the Jesuits were Catholics. Those Catholics, that's terrible.
Yeah.
But of course, in the original sense of casuistry, and you're applied ethicist.
Yeah.
So are you a casuist?
I don't think of myself as a casuist. I think about myself as a little bit more of a systematic applied ethicist. But I do think that paying attention to the context and really does matter. And also understanding that there are situations that we are confronted with in which there are no great answers. And it's still okay to be committed to a particular value, even if we can't figure out how to make that value operative in a particular situation. That really came home during the pandemic, right? In the sense of like, these aren't moral dilemmas of like the traditional sense, but sometimes it is almost impossible to do something good, but you're still required to act for the good. That may be a kind of casuistic hair splitting, but that was a challenging thing to say. This is still an action for the good, even though it's not in itself a really good action. Right? Yeah, casuistry gets a bad rap.
This morning, I went to Starbucks for the first meeting of the year with a woman who's going to go to SEAL. And on that first meeting, I think you're doing practical. So we'll meet on Monday morning, Tuesday. But meanwhile, I'm asking questions and listening to her talk and figuring out where will I go next. In fact, popped open the collected works of Ignatius and went to the beginning, right underneath the title of the exercises is the presupposition, which is the idea of putting best possible construction on what the said. So what I was trying to say to her was, well, the context makes all the difference here. And it's interesting that Ignatius was dealing with the situation very like Rome. She had just been talking about, MAGA and all these difficulties she's run into, and relationships with her founder and so forth. And what I said was, well, he wrote the exercise, the final version of the exercises, right in the midst of the Reformation. And in Southern Europe, it wasn't Protestantism, but there were people called the Almoravians, the illuminated ones, who thought that they had private revelations of the Spirit. And so if you don't start with the presupposition, trust you have to trust.
Yeah.
You can have trust between the director and the directee, but you can't trust in God if you're never.
Yeah.
I think the context makes, and not at all surprising, You figured out that kind of poli-sci isn't going to be the solution.
I know. I mean, I share that story often because students will sometimes ask when they find out I wasn't a philosophy major. And I feel like, wow, was I really that naive as an 18-year-old? And I think in some respects I was, you know, but I had no aspirations of going to graduate school when I went to college. I thought I was going to be a political journalist. I wanted to like be Leslie Stahl, you know, like I wanted to like write for the Washington Post or, you know, something like that. But I quickly discovered I really didn't like that either. Something else has happened with this computer. I just want eventually to log off. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe I've been logged off. But yeah, and I think, you know, when we talk about the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm, so often we skip the talk of context. We go right to experience, reflection, action. But the longer I've been doing this and thinking about this, the more time I want to spend on the context. Because I think that if we don't actually know each other, right, if we don't know where we're starting, I don't know how you can figure out what an experience is that's meaningful, that's going to prompt, you know, the reflection that's going to actually lead to action. And I will say, like, one of the things that struck me while I was with the board in Rome was like, these people, their context is really different than mine. You know, casual conversations about like vacations I've taken and stuff, and I'm just like, I don't vacation the way you vacation. You know, I'm like, I don't know how much money you think the university pays us, but yeah, that's not, you know, just kidding. But it is an important thing to understand, I think, coming out of the height of the pandemic, you know, what the context our students are in, you know, their anxieties, you know, what they want, what they need, what they think they want, what they think they need. You know, we're having to change some of our retreat programs in mission and ministry because kids are like, I'm too anxious to go on a retreat. I'm like, you've totally misunderstand the idea of a retreat, right? And it's not anxious like I'm not going to get my schoolwork done. It's just anxious about being with other people. And that like that makes me sad. That hurts me. You know, hurts me not because they're doing something bad, but just like I hurt that that's where they're at. So we have to think about things differently because what we've always done is not going to work because they are not the same as they were 3 years ago. And that is one of the great challenges of higher education and high school education, or education generally right now, is that we've got a complicated world. Not that that's different than any other time, but we know more about how this complicated world is affecting people. So how do we respond? Well, we've got to understand how it affects individual humans before we can make good on what kind of experiences are right for them right now. How do we open that up? One of the other things I didn't really talk about in this is, of course, just the nature of discernment and how important discernment is in thinking about Jesuit education, Ignatian education, and the ability to, you know, hold things lightly, like to not be so invested in a particular outcome. You know, with students, it's really hard. You really want them to get the most out of their education and to have a good life. And of course, we are invested in that. But the details, I don't know that we should be so invested in. I remember a student that I was advising years ago, and she's just like, are you very disappointed that I want to transfer to another school? I was like, no, we don't have the program you want. I'm super happy to help you transfer to another school that has the program you want. I'm not disappointed. I just want for you what you want for you. She was so perplexed. I was just like, yeah, we got to figure out how to do that more often. That conversation about transferring was about her, not about me. And I felt kind of sad that she would think that I wasn't going to do my all for her because she wasn't going to stay at Gonzaga. We've probably all had conversations with students that are on that track. It's about you. It's not about me. But sometimes this isn't the right fit, whether it's for an employee or for a student. What's right for someone else, that has to be what the focus is. So, any other questions, thoughts? Thank you. This is a small but great audience.
Yeah.